In the poverty-stricken tobacco fields of rural North Carolina, where the red clay earth stretched endlessly under an unforgiving sun, and where the promises of the American dream seemed as distant as the stars, Frank Lucas was born on September 9, 1930, into a world that would forge him into one of the most notorious and innovative criminal leaders in American history. This was the Jim Crow South, where systematic oppression and limited opportunities for African Americans created conditions that would drive countless young men to seek alternative paths to success and survival. The Lucas family sharecropper farm in Greensboro represented the harsh realities of rural Southern life during the Great Depression, where families struggled to survive on land they would never own, while subject to economic systems that perpetuated poverty and dependence. Frank's father, Fred Lucas, worked from dawn to dusk in fields that belonged to white landowners, earning barely enough to feed his growing family while dreaming of opportunities that seemed permanently out of reach. The household that shaped Frank's early development included his mother, Mahalie Lucas, a woman of extraordinary strength who held the family together through sheer force of will and determination. She worked as a domestic servant for white families, while also tending to her own children and managing the endless tasks required for survival in rural poverty. Her influence on Frank would prove profound and lasting, as she instilled in him both the values of hard work and the recognition that conventional paths might not be sufficient for escaping their circumstances. The educational opportunities available to African American children in rural North Carolina during the 1930s and 1940s were severely limited by both legal segregation and economic necessity. The schools designated for black children were underfunded, understaffed, and equipped with outdated materials that had been discarded by white institutions. These conditions created environments where academic achievement was difficult to attain, while also demonstrating the systemic barriers that African Americans faced in pursuing legitimate advancement. Frank's academic performance during his brief school career was complicated by both the poor quality of available education and his growing awareness that formal learning might not provide the tools necessary for overcoming the obstacles that defined African American life in the rural South. His teachers noted his intelligence and natural charisma, but also observed a restlessness and impatience with authority that suggested his attention was being drawn toward alternative sources of knowledge and opportunity. The cultural environment of rural North Carolina during Frank's childhood was characterized by rigid racial hierarchies that were enforced through both legal mechanisms and extra-legal violence that served to maintain white supremacy while limiting African American opportunities for economic and social advancement. The constant awareness of these restrictions created psychological pressures that affected every aspect of daily life while generating frustrations that sought outlets through various means. The incident that would forever alter the trajectory of Frank's life occurred when he was approximately 13 years old, as he witnessed his father being humiliated and physically abused by white men who operated with complete impunity under the racial code that governed Southern society. The experience of watching his father's powerlessness in the face of systematic oppression created both trauma and determination that would influence every subsequent decision in Frank's life. The decision to leave North Carolina was precipitated by this traumatic incident and the recognition that remaining in the rural South would likely condemn him to a lifetime of the same powerlessness and humiliation that had defined his father's experience. The journey northward represented not only geographic movement, but a fundamental rejection of the limitations that Southern society sought to impose on African American aspirations and achievements. The arrival in New York City during the early 1950s placed Frank in the heart of one of the most dynamic and rapidly changing urban environments in America, where the opportunities and challenges were unlike anything he had experienced in rural North Carolina. Harlem, in particular, represented a unique cultural and economic ecosystem where African Americans had created institutions, businesses, and social networks that provided alternatives to the mainstream American society that remained largely closed to their participation. The Harlem that welcomed Frank Lucas was a community in transition, struggling to maintain its identity as the cultural capital of African America, while adapting to post-World War II social and economic changes that were transforming urban life throughout the United States. The neighborhood contained both legitimate businesses and illegal enterprises that provided opportunities for ambitious individuals willing to accept the risks associated with operating outside conventional legal boundaries. The initial survival strategies that Frank employed in New York reflected both the skills he had learned in rural poverty and the new challenges presented by urban life among strangers who had no obligations to provide assistance or protection. His early experiences included various forms of petty crime and street-level entrepreneurship, that taught him valuable lessons about human nature, urban economics, and the complex relationships between legal and illegal activities. The pool hall culture that Frank became involved in during his early years in Harlem provided him with education in gambling, street politics, and the informal economic systems that operated parallel to legitimate business activities. These establishments served as social centers where information was exchanged, deals were negotiated, and relationships were formed that could provide both opportunities and protection in an environment where official institutions offered limited assistance to African American residents. The mentorship that would prove most influential in Frank's criminal development came through his relationship with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a legendary figure in Harlem's criminal underworld who had built a reputation for both ruthlessness and sophistication that distinguished him from ordinary street criminals. Bumpy's approach to criminal enterprise incorporated elements of both traditional Southern criminal culture and modern urban business practices that reflected his understanding of the changing nature of illegal activities. Bumpy Johnson's criminal empire during the 1950s and 1960s was remarkable for its scope and organization, encompassing illegal gambling operations, controlled substances trafficking, and various forms of protection services that generated substantial revenues while providing employment and opportunities for numerous Harlem residents. His organization operated according to business principles that emphasized long-term planning, systematic record-keeping, and strategic thinking that went far beyond the impulse-driven activities that characterized many criminal enterprises. The education that Frank received under Bumpy's tutelage was comprehensive and sophisticated, covering all aspects of criminal enterprise from street-level operations to high-level strategic planning and political coordination. Bumpy understood that successful criminal organizations required not only operational competence but also political protection, community support, and economic diversification that could provide stability and security in an inherently dangerous business environment. The operational philosophy that Bumpy taught Frank emphasized the importance of maintaining respect within the community while demonstrating the power and resources necessary to protect criminal interests against both rival organizations and law enforcement pressure. This approach required careful balance between generosity and intimidation, public visibility and operational security, traditional criminal methods, and innovative business practices. The community relationships that Bumpy had cultivated throughout Harlem were essential elements of his criminal success, as they provided both intelligence about potential threats and opportunities while also generating the popular support that made law enforcement efforts more difficult and less effective. His reputation as a folk hero who provided assistance to community members while standing up to outside authority created political capital that served as protection against both criminal rivals and government pressure. The financial management skills that Frank learned from Bumpy included sophisticated approaches to money laundering, asset protection, and investment strategies that converted criminal proceeds into apparently legitimate wealth while minimizing exposure to law enforcement investigation. These skills would prove essential for Frank's later success in building his own criminal empire while avoiding the financial vulnerabilities that had destroyed many criminal organizations. The violence that characterized Bumpy's operations was strategic and calculated, rather than random or emotional, reflecting his understanding that force was a tool that could achieve specific objectives when properly applied, but could also create problems and attract unwanted attention when used carelessly. The reputation for controlled violence that Bumpy maintained served as a deterrent against rivals while demonstrating to associates and community members that he possessed the capability to protect his interests and those who worked with him. The legitimate business interests that Bumpy maintained throughout Harlem served multiple functions within his criminal enterprise, providing cover for illegal activities while generating additional revenues and offering opportunities for community investment that built popular support. These enterprises included restaurants, barbershops, and various service businesses that employed local residents while contributing to the economic vitality of the neighborhood. The political connections that Bumpy had developed during his decades in Harlem included relationships with elected officials, law enforcement personnel, and community leaders who could provide information, protection, and assistance in exchange for financial compensation and political support. These networks were essential for maintaining operational security while building the influence necessary for long-term criminal success. The international dimensions of Bumpy's operations during the 1960s reflect reflected his understanding that successful criminal enterprises required global perspectives and capabilities that could provide both opportunities and competitive advantages over rivals who focused only on local markets. His relationships with criminal organizations in other countries provided access to products, services, and intelligence that enhanced his organization's effectiveness while creating new possibilities for expansion. The law enforcement challenges that Bumpy faced during his criminal career demonstrated both the limitations and capabilities of government efforts to combat sophisticated criminal organizations that possessed extensive community support, political protection, and financial resources. The periodic arrests and prosecutions that he experienced served more as business expenses than existential threats, as his organization possessed the depth and resilience necessary to survive temporary leadership disruptions. The cultural impact that Bumpy exercised within Harlem extended beyond his immediate criminal activities to encompass broader influences on community attitudes, social relationships, and economic opportunities that affected thousands of residents who had no direct involvement in illegal activities. His success demonstrated the potential for African Americans to achieve wealth and power despite systematic discrimination, while also providing alternative models of leadership and achievement. The educational opportunities that Frank gained through his association with Bumpy extended far beyond criminal techniques to include exposure to art, literature, and cultural sophistication that broadened his perspectives while demonstrating the importance of education and personal development for achieving lasting success. Bumpy's own intellectual interests and cultural awareness influenced Frank's understanding of the connections between criminal success and broader social and economic forces. The family relationships that Frank maintained during his apprenticeship with Bumpy reflected the complex tensions between his criminal activities and his desire to protect and provide for relatives who remained in North Carolina. His ability to send money and assistance to family members while keeping them insulated from the dangers associated with his criminal career required careful management of his public and private identities. The technological innovations that Bumpy's organization adopted during the 1960s included advanced communication systems, surveillance equipment, and transportation methods that provided competitive advantages while demonstrating his commitment to maintaining organizational effectiveness through investment in new capabilities and equipment. The succession planning that Bumpy began during his later years reflected his recognition that successful criminal organizations required institutional continuity that extended beyond individual leaders while providing opportunities for advancement that could motivate loyal associates to maintain their commitment to organizational success. The health problems that began to affect Bumpy during the late 1960s created both challenges and opportunities for his organization, as Frank and other senior associates assumed increasing responsibility for day-to-day operations while preparing for the leadership transition that would eventually be required by Bumpy's declining physical condition. The lessons about loyalty, competence, and strategic thinking that Frank learned from Bumpy during this period would prove essential for his later success in building his own criminal empire, while avoiding many of the mistakes that had destroyed other criminal leaders who lacked similar education and preparation. The community respect that Frank gained through his association with Bumpy provided him with credentials and recognition that would prove valuable when he eventually assumed leadership responsibilities, as Harlem residents who had trusted and respected Bumpy were more likely to accept Frank as his legitimate successor. The business relationships that Frank developed during his years with Bumpy included connections with suppliers, distributors, and other criminal organizations that would provide the foundation for his later expansion into international controlled substances trafficking, while demonstrating his capability to manage complex operations involving multiple participants and jurisdictions. The understanding of law enforcement methods and capabilities that Frank gained through Bumpy's experiences with arrests, prosecutions, and investigations provided him with knowledge about operational security, legal vulnerabilities, and defensive strategies that would prove essential for avoiding the law enforcement pressure that destroyed many criminal organizations. The vision of criminal enterprise as a pathway to wealth, power, and social mobility that Bumpy demonstrated throughout his career provided Frank with both inspiration and practical knowledge about the possibilities and limitations associated with criminal leadership, while illustrating the potential for individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds to achieve extraordinary success through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. By the late 1960s, Frank Lucas had completed his apprenticeship under one of Harlem's most successful and respected criminal leaders, while developing the skills, knowledge, and relationships necessary for building his own criminal empire. The foundation had been laid for innovations that would revolutionize the controlled substances trafficking industry, while demonstrating the potential for African American criminals to challenge established criminal hierarchies and create new models of criminal organization. The stage was set for Frank's emergence as an independent criminal leader who would implement strategies and organizational methods that reflected both the lessons he had learned from Bumpy Johnson and his own vision of the opportunities that were becoming available through the changing nature of international controlled substances markets. The young man from rural North Carolina had been transformed into a sophisticated criminal entrepreneur who was prepared to challenge established criminal organizations while building an empire that would reshape the landscape of American organized crime. The death of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson in July 1968 created a power vacuum in Harlem's criminal underworld that would forever alter the landscape of controlled substances trafficking in America, as Frank Lucas recognized that the traditional methods and supply chains that had defined the industry were ripe for revolutionary innovation. The funeral that brought together hundreds of mourners from throughout New York's criminal community also marked the end of an era and the beginning of Frank's transformation from a skilled lieutenant into an independent criminal leader whose vision would reshape international trafficking networks. The immediate aftermath of Bumpy's death presented Frank with both unprecedented opportunities and existential challenges, as rival criminal organizations moved quickly to claim portions of the territory and operations that the legendary leader had controlled. The Italian-American families who had long dominated organized crime in New York saw the vacancy in Harlem leadership as an opportunity to extend their influence into African-American neighborhoods that had previously operated with relative independence from traditional mafia control. The strategic analysis that Frank conducted during this critical transition period led him to conclusions that would revolutionize the controlled substances industry while challenging fundamental assumptions about how trafficking organizations should operate. Rather than simply attempting to maintain Bumpy's existing operations or seeking accommodation with established criminal families, Frank recognized that the current supply chain structure contained inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that created opportunities for dramatic innovation. The traditional heroin distribution system that had dominated American markets during the 1960s involved multiple layers of intermediaries that connected Asian producers with American consumers through complex networks that included Turkish farmers, French processors, Italian-American importers, and various levels of domestic distributors. Each layer in this chain added markup costs while also creating security vulnerabilities and quality control problems that reduced both profits and customer satisfaction. Frank's revolutionary insight was that these intermediaries were not only unnecessary, but actually counterproductive for building a successful trafficking operation, as they consumed profits that could be retained by an organization that established direct relationships with Asian suppliers while maintaining control over processing and distribution throughout the supply chain. This vertical integration approach would require unprecedented investment and risk-taking, but offered the potential for profit margins that exceeded anything available through traditional methods. The implementation of this strategy required Frank to develop capabilities and relationships that had never been attempted by African-American criminal organizations, as it necessitated travel to Southeast Asia, negotiation with foreign suppliers, coordination of international transportation, and establishment of domestic processing facilities that could handle large quantities of raw materials while maintaining security and quality standards. The geographic focus of Frank's international strategy centered on the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia, where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Burma created a lawless area that had become the world's largest producer of raw opium during the chaos and instability created by the Vietnam War. The military conflicts that raged throughout the region had disrupted traditional authority structures while creating opportunities for criminal entrepreneurs who possessed the resources and connections necessary to establish trafficking networks. The American military presence in Southeast Asia provided Frank with the crucial connection that would make his direct sourcing strategy possible, as he recognized that military personnel and contractors possessed both the access to remote areas and the transportation capabilities that could be adapted for criminal purposes. The corruption and profiteering that had become endemic within military supply chains created opportunities for civilian criminals who could offer financial incentives that exceeded military salaries. The relationship that Frank developed with military personnel stationed in Southeast Asia was built on mutual benefit rather than simple corruption, as he offered substantial financial compensation for services that many soldiers viewed as harmless supplements to their inadequate military pay. The transportation of civilian goods aboard military aircraft was already common practice for personal use, and Frank's operation simply expanded this activity to commercial scale while providing significant financial incentives for participation. The quality control innovations that Frank implemented represented one of his most significant contributions to the controlled substances industry, as he recognized that American consumers would pay premium prices for products that offered superior purity and reliability compared to the diluted and contaminated substances that characterized most street-level markets. The development of his signature product, known as Blue Magic, reflected both marketing sophistication and technical excellence that distinguished his operation from all competitors. The processing facilities that Frank established for converting raw opium into finished heroin were located in military-controlled areas of Southeast Asia, where security was provided by American forces, while technical expertise was supplied by chemists who had been recruited specifically for their knowledge of pharmaceutical processing techniques. These facilities operated with security and quality standards that exceeded those employed by most legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturers. The transportation methods that Frank developed for moving finished products from Asia to American markets represented one of the most sophisticated smuggling operations in history, utilizing military cargo flights, diplomatic pouches, and commercial shipping containers that had been modified to conceal large quantities of controlled substances while avoiding detection by customs and law enforcement agencies. The distribution network that Frank constructed within the United States was based on family relationships and trusted associates who could maintain security while handling the enormous volumes of product that his direct sourcing strategy made available. The decision to employ family members in key positions reflected both his understanding of the importance of loyalty in criminal organizations and his recognition that blood relationships provided security advantages that could not be obtained through other means. The organizational structure that Frank implemented for his trafficking empire was modeled on military principles that emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and systematic procedures for all aspects of operations, from procurement to street-level sales. This approach reflected both his observation of military organization during his Asian operations and his understanding that successful criminal enterprises required professional management that went beyond traditional street-level methods. The pricing strategy that Frank employed for Blue Magic was carefully calculated to maximize both market share and profit margins, while demonstrating the superior value that his direct sourcing approach could provide to customers. By offering higher purity products at competitive prices, he was able to rapidly capture market share from established suppliers while building customer loyalty that would sustain his operation through various challenges. The quality assurance measures that Frank implemented throughout his supply chain included systematic testing of products at multiple stages of processing and distribution, standardized packaging that prevented contamination and tampering, and feedback systems that enabled rapid identification and correction of quality problems that might affect customer satisfaction or organizational reputation. The financial management systems that Frank developed for his trafficking empire were sophisticated operations that handled enormous cash volumes while converting criminal proceeds into legitimate assets through real estate investments, business acquisitions, and various forms of money laundering that minimized exposure to law enforcement investigation. The territorial expansion that occurred during the early years of Frank's independent operation extended his influence throughout the northeastern United States, as demand for Blue Magic created opportunities for geographic growth that had not been available through traditional supply arrangements. The superior quality and competitive pricing of his products enabled rapid penetration of markets that had previously been controlled by established trafficking organizations. The competitive advantages that Frank's direct sourcing strategy provided were so significant that they fundamentally altered the dynamics of the controlled substances industry, while forcing traditional suppliers to either adapt their methods or lose market share to organizations that could offer better products at lower prices. The Italian-American families that had previously dominated heroin trafficking found themselves unable to compete with Frank's prices and quality while maintaining their traditional profit margins. The lifestyle that Frank adopted during the peak of his trafficking success was conspicuously luxurious and reflected both his enormous wealth and his desire to demonstrate the success that his innovative approach had achieved. The expensive clothing, luxury vehicles, and lavish entertainment that characterized his public appearances served both personal satisfaction and business purposes by attracting ambitious associates while intimidating potential rivals. The family involvement that became a cornerstone of Frank's operation included not only his immediate relatives, but also extended family members who were recruited for various roles within the trafficking network based on their individual capabilities and the trust that blood relationships provided. This family-based structure created both operational advantages and vulnerabilities that would affect the long-term sustainability of his criminal empire. The community relationships that Frank maintained in Harlem were complex and sometimes contradictory, as his success in challenging established criminal hierarchies generated both admiration and concern among residents who recognized the potential benefits and risks associated with his activities. The employment opportunities and financial assistance that his organization provided to community members created popular support, while the violence and law enforcement attention that accompanied his operations generated anxiety and opposition. The security measures that Frank implemented for protecting his trafficking operation included sophisticated surveillance systems, armed protection details, and intelligence networks that provided early warning of potential threats from both rival criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies. These security investments were substantial but necessary for maintaining operational effectiveness in an increasingly dangerous and competitive environment. The political connections that Frank began to develop during his rise to prominence included relationships with elected officials, community leaders, and law enforcement personnel who could provide information and protection in exchange for financial compensation and political support. These networks were essential for maintaining operational security while building the influence necessary for long-term criminal success. The international relationships that Frank cultivated during his direct sourcing operations included not only Asian suppliers, but also transportation specialists, financial facilitators, and security providers who possessed the specialized capabilities necessary for complex international criminal enterprises. These relationships required careful management and substantial investment, but provided competitive advantages that justified their costs. The technological innovations that Frank's organization adopted during the early 1970s included advanced communication systems, transportation equipment, and processing technologies that provided operational advantages while demonstrating his commitment to maintaining organizational effectiveness through investment in new capabilities. The media attention that Frank began to attract during his period of greatest success reflected both public fascination with his innovative approach to criminal enterprise and law enforcement frustration with traditional investigative methods that proved inadequate against his sophisticated organization. The publicity that surrounded his lifestyle and operations created both advantages and vulnerabilities that would affect his long-term prospects for avoiding prosecution. The law enforcement challenges that Frank's operation created for government agencies were unprecedented in their scope and complexity, as traditional investigative techniques proved inadequate against a criminal organization that possessed international capabilities, military connections, and community support that exceeded anything previously encountered by American law enforcement. The economic impact of Frank's trafficking empire extended far beyond the immediate participants in illegal activities, as the enormous amounts of cash that his organization generated affected patterns of investment, consumption, and development throughout Harlem and other areas where his operations were concentrated. The legitimate businesses that he acquired and operated provided employment and services while serving as vehicles for money laundering and asset protection. The cultural influence that Frank began to exercise during his peak years extended beyond his immediate criminal activities to encompass broader impacts on fashion, music, and popular culture that reflected both his personal style and the wealth that his innovative approach to trafficking had generated. The image of success and sophistication that he projected influenced young people throughout urban America, while contributing to changing perceptions of criminal organizations and their leaders. The competition with established criminal organizations that intensified during Frank's expansion created conflicts that tested both his operational capabilities and his strategic vision for the future of controlled substances trafficking. The traditional Italian-American families that had dominated the industry for decades found themselves challenged by an African-American organization that possessed superior products, competitive prices, and innovative methods that threatened their established market position. The supply chain innovations that Frank continued to implement throughout the early 1970s included diversification of sourcing locations, development of alternative transportation routes, and establishment of backup processing facilities that provided redundant redundancy and security against disruption by law enforcement or rival criminal organizations. The quality control standards that Frank maintained for Blue Magic created brand recognition and customer loyalty that exceeded anything previously achieved in the controlled substances industry, as users throughout the northeastern United States specifically sought his products while avoiding lower quality alternatives offered by competing organizations. The organizational growth that occurred during Frank's most successful years included the recruitment of hundreds of associates who were employed in various capacities, from street-level distribution to high-level coordination and management. This expansion required sophisticated human resources management and training programs that could maintain organizational discipline while accommodating rapid growth. The financial success that Frank achieved through his direct sourcing strategy generated annual revenues that conservative estimates placed in the tens of millions of dollars, creating wealth that exceeded that of many legitimate businesses while providing resources for continued expansion and innovation. The strategic planning capabilities that Frank developed during this period included sophisticated analysis of market trends, competitive threats, and regulatory challenges that enabled his organization to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining operational effectiveness and profitability. By the mid-1970s, Frank Lucas had successfully built one of the most innovative and profitable criminal enterprises in American history, demonstrating that traditional assumptions about criminal organization and controlled substances trafficking could be challenged by visionary leadership and strategic innovation. His direct sourcing approach had revolutionized the industry while generating enormous wealth and influence that challenged established criminal hierarchies. However, the very success that had elevated Frank to prominence was also attracting attention from law enforcement agencies that were developing new capabilities and strategies specifically designed to combat sophisticated criminal organizations that possessed international connections and advanced operational methods. The stage was being set for confrontations that would test every aspect of the empire that Frank had built, while determining whether his innovations could survive the inevitable pressure from government agencies that possessed their own resources and determination. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas had transformed from an ambitious street criminal into the undisputed king of Harlem's controlled substances trade, commanding an empire that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue while challenging fundamental assumptions about who could succeed in America's criminal hierarchy. His direct sourcing strategy had not only revolutionized the heroin industry, but also created a power structure that posed an existential threat to the Italian-American families that had long dominated organized crime in New York City. The territorial control that Frank exercised over Harlem during this period was more comprehensive and systematic than anything achieved by previous African-American criminal leaders, as his organization had evolved beyond traditional neighborhood boundaries to encompass a criminal empire that extended throughout the northeastern United States while maintaining its spiritual and operational center in the community where he had learned his trade under Bumpy Johnson's tutelage. The organizational structure that Frank had developed by the mid-1970s employed hundreds of individuals in various capacities, from street-level distributors to international coordinators who managed complex logistics operations that connected Asian suppliers with American consumers. This vast network required sophisticated management capabilities that exceeded those of many legitimate corporations while maintaining the security and loyalty that were essential for criminal enterprises operating in hostile environments. The family-based hierarchy that became the cornerstone of Frank's organization reflected both his understanding of the importance of trust in criminal enterprises and his recognition that blood relationships provided security advantages that could not be obtained through other means. His brothers, cousins, and other relatives occupied key positions throughout the network, creating a structure that was both operationally effective and personally loyal to Frank's leadership. The most prominent of these family members was his younger brother Huey Lucas, who emerged as Frank's primary lieutenant and operational coordinator for the organization's most sensitive activities. Huey's role included managing relationships with Asian suppliers, coordinating international transportation, and overseeing the processing facilities that converted raw opium into the finished heroin products that had made Blue Magic the most sought-after brand in the American market. The lifestyle that Frank adopted during his period of greatest success was deliberately conspicuous and luxurious, designed to demonstrate both his personal wealth and the success that his innovative approach to criminal enterprise had achieved. The expensive suits, custom jewelry, luxury automobiles, and lavish entertainment that characterized his public appearances served multiple purposes within his criminal strategy while reflecting his personal transformation from rural poverty to urban affluence. The fashion choices that Frank made during this period were particularly significant, as he deliberately chose to wear clothing and accessories that exceeded even those displayed by established Italian-American crime bosses who had traditionally set standards for criminal elegance and sophistication. The chinchilla coats, diamond jewelry, and custom-tailored suits that Frank favored were not merely personal preferences, but strategic statements about the changing balance of power within New York's criminal underworld. The real estate investments that Frank made during his peak years reflected both his enormous wealth and his understanding of the importance of converting criminal proceeds into legitimate assets that could provide long-term financial security while serving operational purposes for his trafficking empire. His portfolio included luxury homes, commercial properties, and rural estates that served as both symbols of success and functional components of his criminal infrastructure. The most famous of these properties was his mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey, which became a symbol of his extraordinary success and a gathering place for the extended family network that formed the backbone of his criminal organization. The estate included elaborate security systems, entertainment facilities, and living accommodations that rivaled those of legitimate business leaders while providing operational capabilities that supported his criminal activities. The legitimate business interests that Frank acquired during this period served multiple functions within his criminal enterprise, providing cover for money laundering operations while generating additional revenues and offering opportunities for community investment that built popular support within Harlem. These enterprises included restaurants, nightclubs, retail establishments, and service businesses that employed local residents while contributing to the economic vitality of the neighborhood. The community relationships that Frank maintained throughout Harlem were complex and multifaceted, as his success in challenging established criminal hierarchies generated both admiration and concern among residents who recognized the potential benefits and risks associated with his activities. The employment opportunities, financial assistance, and protection services that his organization provided created genuine popular support, while also generating expectations and dependencies that complicated his relationship with the broader community. The charitable activities that Frank engaged in during his period of greatest wealth were strategic investments designed to build popular support while demonstrating his commitment to the community that had provided the foundation for his criminal success. His contributions to local schools, community centers, and social programs created positive publicity while building political capital that provided protection against both rival criminal organizations and law enforcement pressure. The confrontation with Italian-American criminal families that intensified during Frank's rise to prominence represented one of the most significant challenges to traditional organized crime hierarchies in American history. The established families that had controlled heroin trafficking for decades found themselves unable to compete with Frank's direct sourcing strategy, while unwilling to accept the loss of territory and revenue that his success represented. The Lucchese crime family, which had exercised significant influence over controlled substances trafficking in Harlem during previous decades, was among the first to recognize the existential threat that Frank's organization posed to their traditional revenue streams and territorial control. The family's attempts to reassert their authority through intimidation and violence were met with sophisticated resistance that demonstrated both Frank's organizational capabilities and his determination to maintain independence from traditional criminal hierarchies. The negotiations that occasionally occurred between Frank's organization and established Italian-American families were conducted with the formality and strategic calculation that characterized business dealings between sovereign entities rather than simple criminal disputes. These discussions revealed both the respect that Frank had earned through his success and the fundamental incompatibility between his vision of independent African-American criminal enterprise and traditional expectations of subordination to Italian-American authority. The violence that periodically erupted between Frank's organization and rival criminal groups was strategic and carefully controlled, designed to demonstrate capability while avoiding the escalation that could attract overwhelming law enforcement response or threaten the stability of his operations. The reputation for disciplined force that Frank's organization developed served as a deterrent against potential challenges, while reassuring associates and community members that he possessed the capability to protect his interests. The intelligence networks that Frank developed during this period were sophisticated operations that provided early warning of threats from both rival criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies, while gathering information about market conditions, political developments, and business opportunities that could affect his operations. These networks included sources within government agencies, competing criminal organizations, and legitimate businesses that provided valuable intelligence for strategic planning. The corruption relationships that Frank cultivated throughout New York's criminal justice system were extensive and systematic, involving law enforcement officers, court personnel, and political figures who could provide information and protection in exchange for financial compensation. The resources that Frank's organization possessed enabled the provision of incentives that exceeded the annual salaries of most government officials, while creating mutual dependencies that served criminal interests. The media attention that Frank attracted during his period of greatest prominence created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for his criminal enterprise. The publicity surrounding his lifestyle and success enhanced his reputation within criminal circles, while attracting customers who sought the superior products that his organization provided. However, this same visibility also attracted law enforcement attention and created intelligence opportunities for agencies that were developing new strategies for combating sophisticated criminal organizations. The fashion influence that Frank exercised during the 1970s extended beyond criminal circles to affect broader trends in African-American urban culture, as his style choices and lifestyle demonstrations provided models of success and sophistication that influenced fashion, music, and popular culture throughout urban America. The image of wealth and power that he projected challenged traditional assumptions about criminal leadership, while inspiring both admiration and emulation among young people seeking alternative paths to advancement. The international expansion that Frank orchestrated during his peak years extended his operations beyond Asia to include relationships with criminal organizations and suppliers in Europe, Latin America, and other regions that offered opportunities for diversification and growth. These international connections required sophisticated coordination and management, while providing strategic advantages that enabled his organization to adapt to changing market conditions and law enforcement pressure. The financial management systems that Frank's organization employed during this period were among the most sophisticated money laundering operations ever developed by American criminal enterprises, involving networks of legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and investment vehicles that converted enormous amounts of criminal proceeds into apparently legal assets, while minimizing exposure to regulatory scrutiny and law enforcement investigation. The political influence that Frank began to exercise during the mid-1970s extended beyond simple corruption to encompass strategic intervention in electoral processes and policy debates that affected criminal interests. His wealth and organizational capabilities enabled him to support political candidates, influence legislation, and shape public opinion in ways that served his strategic objectives while maintaining apparent legitimacy. The organizational innovations that Frank continued to implement throughout this period included advanced communication systems, sophisticated transportation methods, and security technologies that provided operational advantages while demonstrating his commitment to maintaining organizational effectiveness through investment in new capabilities and equipment. The market dominance that Frank achieved through his direct sourcing strategy created competitive advantages that proved difficult for rival organizations to overcome, as the superior quality and competitive pricing of Blue Magic generated customer loyalty while enabling rapid expansion into new territories that had previously been controlled by established trafficking organizations. The cultural impact that Frank's success had on perceptions of criminal organization and African-American achievement was profound and lasting, as his ability to challenge Italian-American criminal hierarchies while building an independent empire demonstrated possibilities that had not been previously realized by African-American criminal leaders. The training programs that Frank developed for his organization included sophisticated education in operational security, customer service, and business management that exceeded the preparation provided by most criminal organizations, while ensuring that associates possessed the skills necessary for maintaining organizational effectiveness and discipline. The succession planning that Frank began during his period of greatest success reflected his recognition that criminal organizations required institutional continuity that extended beyond individual leaders, while providing advancement opportunities that could motivate loyal associates to maintain their commitment to organizational objectives. The quality control standards that Frank maintained throughout his supply chain continued to distinguish his products from those offered by competing organizations, as systematic testing, standardized processing, and careful handling procedures ensured that Blue Magic maintained the reputation for superior purity and reliability that had enabled his organization's rapid growth. The technological surveillance capabilities that Frank's organization developed during this period included sophisticated monitoring systems that provided early warning of law enforcement activities while enabling real-time coordination of complex operations involving multiple locations and participants. The competitive intelligence operations that Frank conducted against rival criminal organizations provided valuable information about their capabilities, plans, and vulnerabilities while enabling strategic planning that could exploit opportunities for territorial expansion and market share growth. The community integration strategies that Frank employed during his period of greatest influence included systematic investment in local businesses, support for community leaders, and participation in social activities that built popular support while creating networks of information and protection that served his criminal interests. The legal defense capabilities that Frank developed included relationships with prominent attorneys who specialized in criminal law and possessed the expertise necessary for defending against the sophisticated prosecution strategies that government agencies were developing specifically to combat organized crime. The international coordination requirements that Frank's global operations created necessitated sophisticated communication and management systems that could maintain security while enabling real-time coordination of activities spanning multiple countries and legal jurisdictions. The economic impact of Frank's criminal empire on Harlem and surrounding communities was enormous, as the hundreds of millions of dollars that his organization generated created employment opportunities, business investments, and community improvements that affected thousands of residents who had no direct involvement in criminal activities. The law enforcement challenges that Frank's organization posed for government agencies were unprecedented in their complexity, as traditional investigative methods proved inadequate against a criminal enterprise that possessed international capabilities, sophisticated security measures, and extensive community support that exceeded anything previously encountered by American law enforcement. However, the very success and visibility that had elevated Frank to the pinnacle of criminal achievement were also creating vulnerabilities that determined law enforcement agencies could exploit through new investigative techniques, enhanced international cooperation, and systematic financial analysis that targeted the money laundering operations that were essential for his organization's continued success. The lifestyle excesses that Frank embraced during his period of greatest wealth, while serving important strategic purposes within his criminal empire, also created intelligence opportunities for law enforcement agencies that were developing comprehensive investigations designed to penetrate and ultimately destroy his organization through systematic analysis of his financial activities, business relationships, and operational methods. By the mid-1970s, Frank Lucas had achieved everything that he had dreamed of during his impoverished childhood in rural North Carolina, commanding wealth and power that exceeded that of most legitimate business leaders, while demonstrating that African American criminals could successfully challenge established hierarchies and build independent empires that operated according to their own vision and strategic objectives. However, the empire that Frank had built through innovation, determination, and strategic vision was about to face the ultimate test of its resilience and sustainability, as law enforcement agencies that had been developing new capabilities specifically designed to combat sophisticated criminal organizations were preparing to deploy resources and techniques that would challenge every aspect of the criminal infrastructure that had enabled his remarkable success. The beginning of the end for Frank Lucas's criminal empire came not through dramatic confrontations or spectacular violence, but through the patient, methodical work of federal investigators who understood that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations leave traces that can be exploited by persistent law enforcement efforts. The Drug Enforcement Administration task force that began focusing on Frank's operations in the early 1970s represented a new generation of federal investigators who possessed both the resources and strategic vision necessary for dismantling complex international trafficking networks. The investigation that would ultimately bring down Frank's organization was led by Detective Richie Roberts of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, a law enforcement officer whose reputation for incorruptible integrity and methodical investigative techniques had made him the ideal candidate for pursuing criminal leaders who possessed the resources to corrupt traditional enforcement efforts. Roberts's approach to investigating Frank's organization reflected both his understanding of modern criminal enterprises and his recognition that traditional investigative methods were inadequate against sophisticated trafficking networks. The breakthrough that enabled law enforcement to penetrate Frank's security measures came through systematic surveillance and financial analysis that revealed patterns in his organization's activities while identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited for gathering intelligence and building prosecutable cases. The combination of electronic surveillance, physical observation, and financial investigation created a comprehensive picture of Frank's operations that exceeded anything previously achieved against organized crime leaders. The wiretap evidence that investigators gathered during months of surveillance provided unprecedented insight into the structure and operations of Frank's criminal empire, revealing the sophisticated communication systems, hierarchical organization, and international coordination that had enabled his success while also documenting specific criminal activities that could support prosecution efforts. The financial investigation that accompanied the surveillance operations utilized new techniques for tracing money laundering activities and asset acquisition that had been developed specifically for combating sophisticated criminal organizations that possessed extensive legitimate business interests. The analysis of Frank's real estate purchases, business investments, and financial transactions revealed the scope of his criminal proceeds while providing evidence that could support both criminal prosecution and civil asset forfeiture proceedings. The international cooperation that federal investigators secured from law enforcement agencies in Southeast Asia provided crucial evidence about Frank's Asian supply network, while demonstrating the global reach of American law enforcement capabilities when adequate resources and diplomatic support were available. The intelligence gathered from overseas sources filled critical gaps in the domestic investigation, while providing corroboration for evidence gathered through American surveillance operations. The arrest operation that was conducted on January 19, 1975, represented one of the largest coordinated law enforcement efforts ever directed against a single criminal organization, as federal agents simultaneously executed search warrants and arrest warrants at dozens of locations throughout the northeastern United States. The precision and scope of this operation demonstrated both the extensive planning that had preceded it and the determination of federal authorities to completely dismantle Frank's trafficking network. The evidence that was seized during these coordinated raids included large quantities of heroin, substantial amounts of cash, weapons, business records, and communication equipment that provided comprehensive documentation of Frank's criminal activities, while also revealing the sophisticated infrastructure that had enabled his organization's success. The charges that were filed against Frank and his associates included violations of federal controlled substances laws, conspiracy charges, and tax evasion allegations that reflected the comprehensive nature of the investigation, while providing prosecutors with multiple avenues for securing convictions. The potential penalties associated with these charges included life imprisonment without possibility of parole, creating powerful incentives for cooperation with government authorities. The legal strategy that Frank's defense team employed during the initial phases of his prosecution reflected both the strength of the government's evidence and the limited options available for defending against such comprehensive criminal charges. The attorneys who represented Frank possessed extensive experience in criminal law and organized crime cases, but they faced unprecedented challenges in defending against prosecution efforts that had utilized sophisticated investigative techniques and international cooperation. The trial that began in 1976 attracted national media attention as it represented the prosecution of one of America's most successful and innovative criminal leaders, while also demonstrating the federal government's enhanced capabilities for combating sophisticated organized crime. The proceedings provided public insight into both the scope of Frank's criminal achievements and the investigative methods that had been developed to combat modern trafficking organizations. The testimony that was presented during Frank's trial included evidence from undercover agents, cooperating witnesses, and law enforcement officials who had participated in the investigation, while also featuring financial experts who explained the money laundering techniques and asset acquisition strategies that Frank had employed to conceal and legitimize his criminal proceeds. The conviction that resulted from this trial marked the end of Frank's direct involvement in criminal activities, while raising questions about the future of the organizational innovations and market disruptions that his trafficking network had created within the controlled substances industry. The sentence of 70 years in federal prison effectively removed him from active participation in criminal enterprises, while creating opportunities for rivals to claim the territory and market share that his organization had controlled. The decision to cooperate with federal authorities that Frank made following his conviction represented a fundamental transformation in his relationship with the criminal underworld, as he chose to provide information about criminal associates, organizational structures, and operational methods in exchange for reduced sentences and protection from retaliation. This cooperation marked a dramatic departure from traditional criminal codes that prohibited assistance to law enforcement enforcement agencies under any circumstances. The debriefing sessions that Frank participated in during the late 1970s and early 1980s provided federal investigators with unprecedented insight into the structure and operations of organized crime, as his detailed knowledge of criminal networks, corruption relationships, and international trafficking methods enabled law enforcement agencies to build cases against dozens of other criminal leaders and organizations. The witness protection considerations that accompanied Frank's cooperation with federal authorities reflected both the value of the information he provided and the serious threats that his assistance created from criminal organizations that had been affected by his testimony. The security measures that were implemented for his protection demonstrated the federal government's commitment to encouraging cooperation from high-level criminal figures while also highlighting the risks associated with such decisions. The prosecutions that resulted from Frank's cooperation included cases against corrupt law enforcement officers, political figures, and criminal associates who had facilitated his trafficking operations while also enabling broader investigations of organized crime networks that had previously been protected from law enforcement penetration. The sentence reduction that Frank received in exchange for his cooperation reflected both the value of the information he provided and the federal government's recognition that encouraging cooperation from high-level criminal figures required meaningful incentives that could outweigh the risks and consequences associated with violating traditional criminal codes. The prison experience that Frank endured during his incarceration was complicated by both his status as a cooperating witness and his reputation as one of America's most successful criminal leaders. The security measures that were necessary for his protection created isolation and restrictions that affected his physical and mental health, while also limiting his ability to maintain relationships with family members and former associates. The reflection and personal transformation that Frank experienced during his imprisonment included recognition of the human costs associated with his criminal activities and acknowledgement of the communities and individuals who had been harmed by the controlled substances trafficking that had generated his wealth and power. This period of introspection contributed to his later efforts to discourage young people from pursuing criminal careers. The release from federal prison that Frank obtained in 1991, after serving 15 years of his sentence, marked his transition from active criminal leader to reformed ex-convict who sought to rebuild his life through legitimate means, while also sharing his experiences as cautionary tales for young people who might be attracted to criminal activities. The legitimate employment that Frank pursued following his release from prison included various forms of manual labor and service industry work that provided modest income while demonstrating his commitment to avoiding criminal activities. The contrast between his former wealth and power and his circumstances as an aging ex-convict illustrated both the temporary nature of criminal success and the long-term consequences of criminal choices. The public speaking engagements that Frank began accepting during the 1990s provided opportunities for him to share his experiences with students, community groups, and law enforcement audiences while earning modest income through legitimate means. These presentations emphasized the ultimate futility of criminal careers while highlighting the human costs associated with controlled substances trafficking. The family relationships that Frank worked to rebuild following his release from prison were complicated by the years of separation, the trauma associated with his criminal career, and the ongoing consequences of his cooperation with federal authorities. The efforts to reconnect with children and relatives who had been affected by his criminal activities required patience, understanding, and acknowledgement of the harm that his choices had caused. The media attention that Frank received during the 2000s was revitalized by the release of the film American Gangster in 2007, which portrayed his criminal career and depicted both his success as a trafficking leader and his cooperation with law enforcement authorities. The movie, starring Denzel Washington as Frank and Russell Crowe as Detective Richie Roberts, brought renewed public attention to his story, while also generating controversy about the accuracy of its portrayal of his criminal activities. The disputes over the film's accuracy that Frank engaged in during interviews and public appearances reflected both his desire to correct what he viewed as exaggerations and distortions, while also his recognition that the publicity could provide opportunities for legitimate income through book deals, consulting arrangements, and speaking engagements. The consultancy work that Frank provided for filmmakers, journalists, and researchers studying organized crime and controlled substances trafficking generated modest income, while enabling him to contribute to public understanding of criminal organizations and law enforcement efforts. His insights into the structure and operations of trafficking networks provided valuable perspectives for academic and policy discussions about crime control strategies. The community outreach activities that Frank participated in during his later years included programs designed to discourage young people from involvement in criminal activities while providing realistic information about the consequences of criminal choices. These efforts reflected both his genuine desire to prevent others from making similar mistakes and his recognition that such activities could provide meaning and purpose during his post-criminal life. The health problems that began affecting Frank during his 70s were attributed to both the stresses of his criminal career and the normal aging process, creating limitations on his activities while also providing reminders of his mortality and the finite nature of his opportunities for contributing to legitimate activities and relationships. The legacy discussions that Frank engaged in during interviews and public appearances during his final years revealed both pride in his criminal innovations and regret about the human costs associated with his trafficking activities. His reflections on the contrast between his criminal success and the damage caused by controlled substances trafficking provided complex perspectives on the relationship between individual achievement and social responsibility. The historical significance that scholars and journalists attributed to Frank's criminal career focused on both his innovations in trafficking methods and his role in challenging traditional organized crime hierarchies, while demonstrating the potential for African American criminals to achieve unprecedented success in industries that had been dominated by other ethnic groups. The law enforcement impact of Frank's cooperation and the investigative techniques that were developed for combating his organization continued to influence organized crime investigations decades after his arrest, as the methods used by Detective Roberts and federal investigators became standard approaches for investigating sophisticated criminal enterprises with international connections and extensive legitimate business interests. The social impact of Frank's story on popular culture and public perceptions of organized crime was significant and lasting, as his transformation from rural poverty to criminal wealth resonated with broader American narratives about opportunity, success, and the consequences of pursuing illegal means to legitimate ends. The death that came to Frank on May 30th, 2019, at the age of 88, marked the end of a life that had encompassed some of the most dramatic transformations and contradictions in American criminal history. His passing in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, far from the Harlem streets where he had achieved his greatest success, symbolized both the distance he had traveled from his criminal career and the quiet circumstances of his final years. The obituaries and retrospective analyses that followed Frank's death provided opportunities for reflection on both his criminal achievements and his later efforts at redemption, while highlighting the complex legacy of a man who had demonstrated both the potential for criminal innovation and the possibilities for personal transformation. The educational value of Frank's story for understanding organized crime, law enforcement, and social mobility in America continues to provide insights for researchers, policymakers, and community leaders who seek to address the challenges posed by criminal organizations while also understanding the social and economic factors that create opportunities for criminal recruitment and success. The cautionary lessons that emerge from Frank's life include both the temporary nature of criminal success and the lasting consequences of criminal choices, while also illustrating the potential for personal redemption and the importance of providing alternatives to criminal careers for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The historical context that Frank's career provides for understanding American organized crime during the 1960s and 1970s reveals both the changing dynamics of criminal organizations and the evolution of law enforcement capabilities that were developed to combat increasingly sophisticated trafficking networks and international criminal enterprises. The innovation legacy that Frank left within criminal organizations includes both the direct sourcing strategies that revolutionized controlled substances trafficking and the demonstration that traditional criminal hierarchies could be challenged by visionary leadership and strategic innovation that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The law enforcement legacy of the investigation and prosecution of Frank's organization continues to influence modern approaches to combating organized crime, as the techniques developed by Detective Roberts and federal investigators provided models for investigating complex criminal enterprises that possess international connections and sophisticated security measures. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Frank Lucas, we are confronted with a complex story of innovation, success, failure, and redemption that illustrates both the potential for individual transformation and the lasting consequences of criminal choices. His journey from rural poverty to criminal prominence to cooperation and attempted redemption provides insights into the factors that drive individuals toward criminal careers, while also demonstrating the possibilities for change and contribution that can emerge even from the most unlikely circumstances. The story of Frank Lucas serves as both a cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of criminal success and an illustration of the complex social and economic factors that create opportunities for criminal organizations, while challenging law enforcement agencies to develop new capabilities and strategies for protecting public safety and upholding the rule of law. For those who have followed this examination of one of America's most innovative and controversial criminal leaders, we hope this exploration has provided insights into the complex relationships between individual ambition, social opportunity, and the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate success in modern American society. If you have found this deep dive into the rise and fall of Frank Lucas compelling, we invite you to subscribe to Sleep Crime, where we continue to explore the most significant criminal cases and historical developments that have shaped our understanding of crime, justice, and human nature. Join us as we examine the stories that reveal both the darkest and most redemptive aspects of the human experience.